Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to present. Thank you for organizing the event. And so what I'm presenting is a little bit different, I think, in terms of what the presentations that we've seen yesterday, but also a little bit different in terms of what I usually do. I've never really done this kind of format before, and it's an abridged version of a story from the current project that you so kindly mentioned from the book. And again, it's an anthology that explores how we might understand the climate crisis through different forms of narrative. And it's combining speculative fiction, speculative nonfiction, which, to be honest, I just discovered was a real term and genre about a couple of months ago, as well as critical essays and guest essays and visual essays. So in the context of this symposium on kind of AI architecture and storytelling, what I'm really presenting is an investigation into how AI systems become spatial infrastructure. And so while much of the work focuses on AI as a design tool, this story actually examines AI as territorial practice, looking at the algorithmic systems that determine who can move where, and what resources they can access and how they can experience space itself. And so the story, which I will begin in a second, is set in 2069. It maps systems that exist at the intersection of policy and geography, of bureaucracy and biometrics, and really where protocols kind of become the architecture of everyday life. And so these are spaces that can't be captured in the traditional kind of architectural drawing, because they kind of exist in the gaps between, I would say, in the treaty clauses and shipping manifests, in the algorithmic decisions that really determine who gets to move and where. And so we know from architectural theory like Lefebvre or Easterling and many other writers that neutral technical systems, or things that seem like neutral technical systems, like building codes, zoning ordinances, infrastructure standards, all of those actually encode political and spatial and social relationships within them. And so what this story traces, at least in the long form work is, I don't know, kind of 10,000 words, and this I've radically reduced. It should be about a 25-minute presentation, and then I'm going to show a little bit of the studio work. But what the story traces is how new forms of protocols, like carbon calculations, like that what I mentioned before, like the biometric tiers, logistics codes, are creating new territories of inclusion and exclusion that really operate through data rather than walls. And so the story follows Humboldt Keen, who's named after the author of the prior quote, Alexander Humboldt, who effectively in his time kind of founded the word ecosystem. It's the first time we really hear ecosystem used. It's the first time we're really describing nature as a kind of thing other than architecture, and it's the first time nature really becomes othered, but he's also kind of considered as one of the first environmentalists. And so the story follows Humboldt Keen. He's a researcher specializing in climate migration corridors, which is the global infrastructure, or will be potentially, designed to move billions of people from climate-devastated regions into habitable zones. And so he's traveling on one of the last flights or commercial flights ever, as air travel is being phased out due to climate collapse, exhaustion of fossil fuels, overheated runways. And so his journey takes him from a shuttering, closing Heathrow through Neom to Antarctica. His job is to observe how the migration infrastructure works in practice, and this is his journey. So again, to review the quote, the most dangerous worldviews are the worldviews of those who've never viewed the world. Okay, we begin Heathrow Terminal 5, April 4th, 2069, 9:36. Humboldt Keen is our character. He has clearance, observation clearance through all tiers. Okay. Terminal 5 smelled of burned coffee and abandonment. Humboldt walked past shuttered duty-free shops and empty seating areas, the hum of vending machines louder than they should have been. There were only 2 flights out today. Heathrow was on its last legs. Its very last gasp, it was a shell. Terminal 5 decommissioning was scheduled for October 27. 2070, with all outbound routes assigned to CRP air corridors. He reached for the bottle of water he'd bought from a vending machine. He hadn't had bottled water in years. The guilt was immediate and familiar. Carbon costs calculating in his head like a reflex. Bottle production, carbon footprint, 82.8 grams of carbon dioxide produced. Water bottling process, 5 to 10. Bottle transport, vending machine. The model world, he thought, was measured in permissions and emissions, what you were allowed to do and what you burned doing it. The advertisement screens still functioned, a desperate waste of energy with so few travelers. The ad changed to the CRP. Humboldt was heartened to see it. The climate refugee passport was helping 1.5 billion people relocate from climate-devastated regions. It was an incredible success story. Humanity coming together as one world for all. He watched the video loop, smiling family, biometric scan, concrete border wall dissolving into verdant trees. Decades in the making, the CRP, the Climate Refugee Passport, granted displaced climate refugees legal status and movement rights into habitable regions. He walked through the terminal, a place he'd moved at all points in his life, traveling with family, to university, for work, for pleasure. The nostalgia was unexpected and sad. This was one of the last departing flights from Heathrow, certainly the last he would ever take. Humboldt reached for his own climate passport as he headed towards security and to the gate. Sometimes you'll see also some of these images popping up, which are related headlines from our time. Hours later, the seatbelt sign turned off and he reclined in the seat, settling into the flight for Neom. Later, as they passed over the Alps, he scanned the peaks below, searching for the last of the glaciers. One, maybe two thin remnants of ice remained. Each year they retreated further, exposing millennia of scraped rock. There was rarely snow anymore. The last snowfall had been in 2064, briefly dominating news cycles before melting into memory. He thought of his mother and the photos she'd used to show him of mountains buried in snow. She'd loved to ski when that was still possible. In her 20s, working at UCLA's Institute for Carbon Management, she would drive to Mammoth on winter weekends, and even then the snow was unreliable. The resorts had squeezed every last cent from the industry, raising prices so high, but by the time there was no snow left, there were very few people who could even afford the privilege anyway. His parents had both been geoengineers who'd met at the 2032 Mumbai Marker Conference, the defining moment when the world accepted what could no longer be reversed. Air travel phase-out, irreversible collapse of the Thwaites Glacier, and failed net zero pledges. Mumbai Marker wasn't just a crisis summit, it was where the first serious frameworks for planetary repair were drafted. It was there that the CRP had been conceived as the first step towards a post-nation world, defining regions of livability, not colonization, although it would be more than a decade before it was finally implemented. He thought of everything that his parents had accomplished, and still they had decided to have a child despite the collapse, to educate him to be part of the solution. He'd grown up under these expectations, and it was often an exhausting torch to bear. 2 movies and 2 meals later, Humboldt switched to the aircraft's nose cam and saw a vast expanse of desert fill the screen. As they descended, he could see Neom stretching deep into the horizon. Neom, Saudi Arabia. It's a CRP hub, April 4th, 2069, 2037. The Neom terminal, unlike Heathrow, was heaving with travelers. It was one of 5 global hubs redirecting climate migrants alongside Houston, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Lagos, and Montevideo. Unlike the others, Neom hadn't emerged organically at the intersection of migration routes. It had been designated a hub through negotiations that few understood, but likely involved vast sums of money. Architecturally and inevitably, the terminal was a glass-encased monument, impossible to see outside through the condensation. The humid interior distorted the desert beyond into glittering beige spheres. At the immigration checkpoint, a wall of cubicles spanned the width of the entry. A smiling attendant presented an array of contact lenses, explaining that all visitors required them, protection from intense desert sun and compatibility with the city's high-frequency smart infrastructure. Humboldt chose blue lenses matching his own eyes. As she inserted them, he felt a distinct pressure on his eyeballs. He moved over to the ID control lines, one for legacy national passports and 24 at least for the CRP. Impressive, except passengers were being pulled from lines when their scans turned red. He asked an airport staffer what the red indicated, and well aware that the CRP allowed free movement. She motioned him forward without answering, and as his face scanned, he felt pressure on his eyeballs once again before being ushered through. As a mobility systems research fellow, his work specialized in corridor logic and maximization of flow. His team had modeled friction points across global movement corridors and their rerouting through the 5 hubs to identify and minimize infrastructural bottlenecks. Their broader goal had been to foreground efficiency as a fundamental instrument of equity. But after watching NEOM's silent redirections, he wondered if their vision of equitable efficiency had been repurposed and reappropriated as mechanisms for smoother exclusion. Inside NEOM's main atrium, sandwiched between the 500-meter-high towers that seemed to extend and disappear into the horizon, Humboldt couldn't believe what he was seeing. He heard rushing water and saw a river moving through the central courtyard. Gardens were lush, birdsong filled the air. The interior was a comfortable 22 degrees Celsius, almost like a gorgeous day in London, engineered in the deserts of Saudi Arabia. Humboldt wandered over to an exhibition extolling NEOM's virtues. It was predictable, highlighting vertical farming successes, water desalination, adaptive energy grids, nothing he hadn't learned in school already. He walked back towards the vast atrium, and out of nowhere, a bird or a drone flew disturbingly close. As he ducked, flailing at the bird, his arm crashed into his face and dragged the right contact lens out of place. Blinking furiously, he gasped at what he saw. The buildings ended abruptly in the distance. With his left eye, he saw the complete line stretching to the horizon. With his right, the buildings ended barely 200 meters away. He literally could not believe his eyes or his eye. Nothing was real. The buildings were incomplete, suggesting NEOM was the delusion everyone had always warned of. A concerned concierge rushed over. "Sir, is everything all right?" Remembering all those travelers who'd been denied entry, Humboldt rubbed his eye, smiled, and mumbled something about allergies. The concierge made a deliberate eye contact, and just in time, he felt the contact lens slide back into place with that pulsating squeeze. What had he just seen? The lenses weren't protective, clearly. They also weren't augmented reality. They were AI-mediated perception, completing what wasn't there. So to break out of the story for a second, what we're witnessing is really infrastructure that operates through mandatory interfaces. The lenses aren't optical enhancement. They're required equipment that determines what reality you're allowed to perceive, and that's government or governance at the level of sensory experience itself. And we already know from Tuesday night's meetup that at least 3 people in this room have the meta glasses. So no, one can wonder what kind of inherent biases might be in those lenses, not to mention in future far more powerful interfaces. Okay, back to the story. A woman brushed past Humboldt, pointing at the birds circling the atrium. "You're an observer, right?" She didn't wait for an answer. "Keep observing. You'll understand more in Antarctica, but remember what you saw here today." And she pointed up, exclaimed out loudly, distractingly, "White spectacled bulbul, how lovely." And before he could respond, she disappeared into the crowd. He was overwhelmed by everything he'd seen and experienced. Humboldt tried to shake off the encounter as he headed back towards the terminal, not noticing something was a little amiss with the bird. He'd hoped to meet with his colleague, Yuhan Lin, during his layover. They'd collaborated on refugee corridor simulation models, but her flight from Shenzhen, Guangzhou had been delayed. And after what he'd just witnessed, he wondered if they were being kept apart for a reason. He headed back into the terminal towards his next flight. McMurdo Station, Antarctica. Tier exempt, April 5th, 2069, 1750. Humboldt stood overlooking the agricultural district's heavily insulated seed labs and greenhouses, the focus of his observation visit this time. He was scheduled to begin his observations the next day, but with nothing else on his agenda, he decided to start early. After registering his fingerprint on the tablet, the portal launched with the usual reminder, Tier 1 observation mission only. Observe, but not question, nor disrupt observations. Include issues in summary notes only before leaving Antarctica. As he entered the greenhouses, he felt the warmth and humidity immediately. He shed his layers and entered the grow space. He heard the suction as the door was resealed, fans overhead blasting warm air to fill what had leaked out. 4 grow bays ran the length of the building, separated by walkways, one of 3 connected units, each 100 by 20 meters, designed to connect into super grow houses. There were grow bays all over the broader McMurdo region. The Antarctic experiment was an incredible open source and shared resource for global knowledge and sustenance. The earthy compost smell was wonderfully sensory overload after the sterile ice landscape. The lab complex produced dwarf grains, additives, and binders for a universal meal. It was work to streamline high-quality, nutrient-dense food production. The Antarctica labs were special for their open source work extending beyond migration into safe zone food supply chains. Bridget, one of the lab technicians, showed him advances in sorghum, lentils, millet, teff, shelf-stable mycelium proteins. Later at dinner, he sampled everything, teff crackers, miso broth, spirulina yogurt. It was all fine. A young engineer leaned over, hey, have you tried the Tier 1 flavors yet? Bridget cut in quickly, he means Bay 1. We do not produce foods for Tier 1 regions. We support climate refugee corridors only. And she glared at the young technician, and Humboldt made a mental note to record this in his observation notes as well. That night, a cryptic message arrived from Yuhan Lin. Corridor 3 deviated routes are confirmed. Check the shipment manifests and tags. Look for rerouting to Tier 1 zones. Humboldt was shocked. If food was being deviated from climate corridors to either unaffected or wealthy zones, the loss of food aid would be devastating to millions. The next morning, the logistics manager showed him containers being loaded, tagged for all the food corridor hubs. Montevideo, Lagos, Bangalore, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, everything matched on manifests, container labels, the routes, certified CRP verification. And they stood for a while and watched the meditative movement of cargo and cranes. A blip on her screen caught his eyes. One shipment destination changed from Bangalore to Rotterdam. Sylvie angled her shoulder, tapped on the screen, and it reverted back. Did that just list Rotterdam as a destination? Humboldt asked. It was just routing codes, she replied, not looking at him. Everything moves properly within corridor networks. On the walk back, he passed an area previously obscured. The ship was gone, revealing rows of containers labeled as agricultural units, grow pods, mycelium pods, soil-free modules. A crane operator shouted at him to move, stacking another unit. Where are these headed? Humboldt called. St. Petersburg, Rotterdam, Dubai, Singapore, I don't know where else. High demand these days. Not one of those cities was climate corridor aligned, and he read the nearest tracking label. And he saw the container was rerouted to Singapore. And once again, Addendum 5.2 was used as a reason. Clause Addendum 5.2, and he remembered when Yuhan had flagged the addendum as dangerous, easily abused for resource rerouting. Outputs of publicly funded Antarctic research were being diverted to elite zones, using weather as a distraction. It was theft disguised as logistics. And so here's another kind of mini breakout of the story. We see how potential protocols can function as territorial control. Shipping codes and tier classifications, they're not administrative categories, but really spatial technologies that can determine access to resources. And so it operates what we might call as protocolized territory, space governed not by the traditional boundaries of walls and borders, but by protocols that sort and route and exclude. And so the shipping container becomes a kind of architecture. Its code determines not just destination, but access to survival itself. As Humboldt walked back to the dorms, he thought about everything he'd seen and experienced over the last 2 days. His observation was being complicated. He knew he wasn't allowed to intervene, but he needed to do something or contact someone. The violations he'd seen so far were far beyond anything he'd anticipated. And back at the dorms, the security clerk barely looked up when he entered. Your observation period has ended. You submit your tablet. Flight departs at 0500. What do you mean, where to? I'm supposed to have 3 more days here. Be ready at 5. The clerk's eyes never left the desk. In his room again, he tried to contact his administrative team. Communications were down. And in 6 years of this work, this had never happened. The communication network was supposed to be robust and always reliable. This blackout felt deliberate and isolating, but there was nothing left to do but pack. Shenzhen, Guangzhou, CRP hub, April 8th, 2069, 1342. He awoke drowsy from the sedatives, having been forced onto the plane after refusing to board. 18 hours later, he was shocked to learn of his destination, not London, where he'd started and where he'd been supposed to return to. His flight had been round trip, requiring innumerable applications and dispensations for one of the last observation routes, with one of the last flights out of Heathrow ever. And now he'd been rerouted with no way home. Exile, clearly. The terminal noise struck him, or the lack of it. No jostling, no pushing or shouting. Everyone was in it together. Too many people to get ahead or stand out. Just collective shuffling and murmured conversations. At the CRP scanner, his screen turned red. An officer processed him quickly. His fears confirmed, downgraded from observation to Tier 3 general population. Observation mobility status was revoked. As a resident of a non-threatened region, he had no movement privileges here. His communications account was blocked. He left the terminal and walked for hours, and eventually walked towards the local CRP headquarters. The building looked old and overused. Queue barriers were endless. Inside, sterile lighting, dense signage. Communications ping relay system again, still blocked. Someone directed him to a communications shop around the corner, an innocuous storefront full of high-water waiters and fishing gear, but confused and too tired to think, he still went inside. The vendor waved him to a door at the rear of the shop. The back room was another reality. Screens filled the walls. The only sounds were typing on borrowed devices as people sat on leather seating. He was handed a device, an encryption cipher, messages only, no calls, and he messaged Yuhan, "I'm here, near CRP offices. Ping block, can you meet?" Over an hour later, "Yes, remember the restaurant? Same building, rooftop tonight." Hours later, he was so tired, he climbed slowly, hand grazing the railing, gripping his backpack strap for balance. The stairwell was exposed, wind funneling through with wet, humid air, kind of like Pittsburgh. By the time he reached the top, his legs trembled, mouth dry, lungs full of thick, humid air. Yuhan was there, leaning against an AC condenser, silhouetted by the pink LED billboard glow. He dropped his bag over and walked towards her. The relief was intense, seeing her and being seen by her after feeling so lost. "You've seen things, finally," she said. And he told her about the manifests, the container reroutes, the Addendum 5.2 violations. They're misusing the clause, exactly how you said, inventing weather events to trigger rerouting to non-corridor destinations. And she looked towards the skyline. "And now you've been stripped of your status?" A roof tarp shifted in the wind. "I'd hoped I'd misread things, Antarctica's diversions, Neom's fakery. There was a woman at Neom who knew who I was and what I was doing. My lens slipped, I saw the buildings. I'm not making sense, I know." He exhaled. "We worked so hard to design fair systems." "We built a system that wasn't supposed to be political," he said, and his voice barely audible over the wind. He looked out over the sprawling city lights. "Do you remember Nkonkwo's speech in Nairobi? This system must be planetary, not political. Its boundaries will not be drawn by wealth, nation, or race, but by climate and water and soil. Survival must be governed by geography, not legacy." Humboldt turned back to Yuhan. "That's what we thought we were building, just a fair world governed by climate, temperature, water, soil, survivability." And for a while, that's what it was. Yuhan's voice was quiet, and she walked to the edge of the roof, looking down at the elevated walkways below. But the map always gets redrawn. A map is the greatest political tool of all. We built corridors to protect the vulnerable, and they became channels back to power. But we have to remember that for a time, we built something different that we witnessed when it was starting to crack. Humboldt didn't know how long he'd been up on that roof. Yuhan had left, and below, the city stretched outward. The city had been a trade hub for over 2,000 years, And now it was a CRP corridor moving people from fragile regions to habitable ones. It was always the same, a boundary adjusted, a clause appended, a loophole widened for the privileged few. He'd believed climate would be the one line no one could manipulate, and that collapse might finally align the world to something elemental. But whoever holds the pen or codes the algorithm controls the map, and he'd seen at last how those lines were drawn. So we started a little late, so my time marker is not exactly right. Carnegie Mellon University, Pittsburgh. So what we've traced through the story is how protocols become spatial governance, how carbon calculations and tiers and biometrics and logistics codes actually create new forms of territory that operate through data rather than walls. And so, in my view, the story traces how AI applications, from carbon guilt calculations to shipping code and shipping route optimizations to augmented reality interfaces, really create what we might call AI-mediated territory. And they're not just digital tools, but spatial governance, systems that resist conventional architectural documentation or the drawing. And the question I think this raises for architectural practice is, how do we develop tools for making visible the algorithmic relationships that increasingly govern spatial ideas and spatial access? And so as computational systems determine everything from urban mobility to housing approval to climate adaptation, we also need methods for understanding how protocols function as territorial practice. And as AI becomes infrastructure, architectural research then needs methods for all of those kinds of modes. And so storytelling also offers a way to reverse engineer those kind of complex AI governance networks. So that is the end of the Humboldt-Keene part of the presentation. The other night, I was asked to include also a bit of student work and show what the studio is doing, which I do have as well. I'll just turn that down. So as mentioned, I teach at the studio, was called the Entertainment Studio. I'm changing it this year. It's called the Speculative Worlds Studio. And so we really explore how architecture intersects with fiction and media and the moving image. And so for the past, I would say 7 years, I think, I can't remember. We've been really focusing primarily on film and game design, but going forward, we're not thinking about the format as much as we are focusing on the kind of world building, full fleshing out of the environment, and then seeing what the output and format can be from that. So we are in an architecture school, so our work is rooted in the built environment and the kind of natural environments that we've shaped. And so we use that as the foundation for the speculative narratives that reflect, I would say, the urgencies and complexities of our time. From environmental collapse, I'd never heard cli-fi before, but I think we also sit kind of in that arena. But we also kind of looking at all the other sort of contemporary issues like surveillance culture, artificial intelligence, of course, supply chain breakdowns, I guess because we're in LA next to the Long Beach port, the kind of supply chain issue also dominates some of our narratives. And students begin or develop stories that really begin in reality and extend outward, just slightly into the near future. And so each project begins with research and observation, what's happening in the world, and where might a story unfold from a moment. And so we spend a significant amount of time on the world building the kind of physical, aesthetic, and cultural logics of a world before even touching what one might call story or plot. The narratives are speculative, but never really untethered from fact. We usually take cues from science fiction, although I wouldn't say that in most, maybe this project accepting, that most of the work fits in the science fiction sort of aesthetic or category. The works are kind of rooted in science and they're fictional, and so in that sense we sit in that category. But we're not trying to escape reality or imagine a kind of far future, but really just slightly skew a kind of relevant contemporary issue. And so what happens if just one small thing changes and that small shift becomes the hinge point for a larger architectural and societal ripple effect? And in that way, then storytelling becomes the sort of design methodology or a way of thinking about architecture, not as a form of space necessarily, but also a set of conditions unfolding over time. And so ultimately, the stories learn to kind of craft immersive, visually rich, and intellectually grounded films, we hope, that expand the role of the architect as well, not only as builder of worlds, but as a narrator of them. Something just slightly different. We're always looking for kind of interesting partnerships and collaborations, and we had a really great opportunity in spring 2024 to work with Appia Agency. It's a virtual production studio in Barcelona. In LA, of course, we are in the home of virtual production studios, but you're absolutely not able to, or at least we have not found a way to collaborate with them. Everyone gives us a quote of $100,000 for a 2-day visit. We were in Appia for 2 days, and he also, my former student is, that person. And it's his company, and he said if he would charge us, it would have been 38,000 euros. So we had a really great kind of 2-day workshop, which was, I think, really special also because it gave us a chance to step out of the usual sort of academic and digital workflow and think about or engage with real-world film production. But yeah, the clip also shows, so the students built or modified the environment that's in the background, and the student directors then used the virtual production space to capture then live shots, which some of the students then composited back into their films. And so we were able to blend the physical footage or the live footage with their imagined Unreal sequences. And you'll see, I don't know if the latter has come out in the video already, they were bringing any random prop from their warehouse to simulate also walking on uneven ground, because when she was walking straight across the floor, it just was completely discontinuous. And so I think that hands-on experience was a sort of really interesting blend of digital and physical worlds, and really allowed us to engage with that kind of technology and think about how it can change the workflows once we got back into the studios. So it's a kind of snippet into the worlds of the studio as well. The end. Thank you very much.
Okay, I don't have a mic, but I'll organize one. This one. Thank you, Natasha, for this fantastic talk, and also for carrying us along, really performing that kind of journey, carrying us along with Humboldt into the not so far future. I'm sure that there are questions in the room. I might start with one that I'm grappling with, which is if we kind of think of our role as architects, as world makers, and also world builders in the process of doing that. And at the moment, when we are on our phones reading the news, and we're in this doom scrolling moment that only knows one trajectory, which is down, and so there's a specific vector that comes with this kind of dystopic story that is super productive in terms of thinking of the connections and causalities that might unfold, as you say, that we can reverse engineer. But then I'm also wondering how do we as architects create space for widen the trajectories of possible futures? How do we create space for random encounters or things that don't make sense or things that are contingent or don't really follow a clear logical path, but kind of stretch open, widen, and open a path for our imagination so that we kind of, there's also hope in our stories. But this would be my first question.
Yeah, it's interesting because as I was writing this one, I was like, wow, I usually ban dystopic or stories without the uplift, and in the longer version, it does suggest a kind of transformation. I don't know if anybody's read Ministry for the Future by Ken Robinson. Anyway, I read that book and couldn't stop talking about it for 2 years. And it's a climate, it's an interesting novel in that it's a kind of story about the environmental collapse, and it takes several hundred pages before things start shifting in an upward trajectory. And interestingly, in that case, it's because politically and globally they introduce a kind of climate coin, like a Bitcoin, and so once you invest in the economy of environmentalism, then all of a sudden everybody's on board, right? And so that started to signal a kind of big upswing. I think in this particular case, because it was about regional shift and global food supply, and I was writing it in the spring of 2025 with a US upheaval kind of, every 5 minutes a different kind of headline. That's where it went. The others in the book are primarily kind of really optimistic, although I will say that in terms of finding space for the architect to intervene, at least the longer, I don't know if it came across in this version, but at least in the longer form version of this piece, it starts to dive really deeply into describing the space, the materiality, the texture, but as well as the I don't know, in one of the slides I had the, where is it? Might be this one. And this one. The charter, it has all of the sort of specs and in some cases technical specifications of some of the growth spaces in Antarctica, and so you begin to, as an architect, think about fleshing out all the kind of world aspects. And so in that sense, I think, we ask an architect to design a museum, and the architect always says, like, can I also curate the first exhibition? Because we pretty much think we, want to and can do all of it. And I think venturing into kind of speculative world building gives you many different opportunities to investigate all of those kind of moments and entry points into where the world is that you're designing.
Thank you. Yes.
I've been told I've been very collaborative and participating. But I was wondering your opinion on the use of these generative algorithms to produce this imagery. Mm-hmm. So in the Renaissance, we had the floor plans, the sections, and then the perspective came, and then it was thought as it's going to break architecture because everybody can understand, and there is no abstraction needed to see the space.
No gatekeeping.
And then now I have the feeling with all of this diffusion or generative algorithms, then we're having kind of the same fear of them. Everybody can produce anything, but then how do we use them as an instrument for design? That's what perspective eventually became, because now we do design through the perspective drawing, which was not the case when it started happening. And so it's more like I'm curious to know your position on that end. How do you see these diffusion models as instruments for design, if you could think of them in that way, in the parallel that I reach with this perspective drawing?
Sure. You said at the beginning you think of yourself as a collaborator, but...
No, participant. I wanted to say I like participants.
Oh. I was like, where's this question going? I think, yes, all the images are generated. And that probably took, I don't know, realistically, like 6 or 7 days. It was, because there's some images that I could not generate. Like I tried for a couple of hours, and then I tried in Photoshop and feed it back in, and they just were not possible, and I was going to then, go the Unreal way and do it really slowly. And then I just thought, well, it's actually fine without the image. I think they become design tools if you have a very clear idea of what you want the image to look like or what you want to achieve. I think where it becomes unproductive and where, at least in the studio, I don't ask students to use it until they have a real clear idea and trajectory and have an ability to kind of control the output. I think then it becomes an interesting tool for concept art development, and certainly now with image to 3D model, it could be great for having a more precise level of control over the incorporation of assets into a world. We were talking about it on the way over. What's always been very difficult to kind of, block, mitigate, deal with is is when students do have a kind of really interesting concept art and creative vision, and then they go to some, online warehouse and they just download whatever is closest, but it's not good, right? And so that happens also with AI. It's like, oh, I banged out this prompt and this is my image. Like, but is this what you wanted? Is there a level of control? And then it's also not a design tool. And I think once you have control, or once you have enough control that you can get as close to your intent as possible, I think then it becomes a really interesting design tool. But I think if you just approach it as like, oh, I just typed out this thing and here's my image and that is it, and there's no revision, or I think most of them had at least like 40 iterations. I had to buy a lot of additional time. The bird one took, probably over 100. It was ridiculous. The cameras were on the leg, the cameras were in the wings, the cameras were all over, and I was like, put it in the eye. And then it was like a whole retro steampunk headset. It's interesting the words that you use, and I think we were talking about this at dinner, when you remove one word or add one word, like I can't remember who was talking about fractured. You can't write fractured. Fractured realities, everything's like cracked mirrors, right? And there's some words that lead to immediate like sci-fi kind of aesthetics, and so that becomes an interesting exercise.
So I'm curious about the use of control in your narrative now, that when you get control, then probably you can use it as an interim for design. Could you try to think of another word rather than control, maybe mastery, or maybe so I'm just a bit fixated with that.
Yeah, no, it's fair.
Because the relation of master-slave, it has never proven to be something successful. I don't know.
Well, I think that it's interesting that they're text prompts, right? And so what's become, I think for me, a kind of interesting opportunity to think about how we use language is when you say fractured reality, somebody else in the room might also think about like steampunk aesthetics, or might think about a broken mirror. And so what you say and how it's visually embedded in your mind with your visual intent and aesthetics and background and history or continuum I was talking about with somebody, I think is a very different thing to what someone else might perceive. And so for me, that kind of exercise in language and prompting has been a really interesting exercise. And so I'm not having control over the system, I'm having control over my use of language, which I think makes it a more productive conversation to have interpersonally as well as whichever chat system I'm using. I think it's not a control over something, but it's just having some sort of, and I'm not sure mastery is even at this point within my vocabulary or my experience with the system, because I won't claim I have mastery at all. It's a kind of evolving process, and every update I'm sure, like I did this before 5, and so, but then I also switched to Claude halfway through because the prompting exchange was better. So I'd write the prompt, produce the image, give it feedback, say like, oh, for whatever reason I have lasers, like I don't want lasers. What word is producing lasers? Or like the fractured reality, and you also have to troubleshoot language, and I think that becomes really interesting, especially in a room with people who don't all have English as a first language. I didn't, I do now, but I think that becomes always a conversation.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I love it, big fan, and the rest. I'm just curious. I'm just curious about why Humboldt is so surprised to see this.
I know, right? A little annoying.
No, because I'm just thinking like the whole idea of an ecosystem, and then with this kind of disconnected observer as well. Somehow this kind of retains even throughout your talk as well. So he still remains kind of disconnected from what is being observed. Even the kind of images you produce, they're almost always like this Caspar David Friedrich looking out and never being truly involved in a way. So even this lens is somehow always lying.
Blurry.
Yeah. So I'm just curious about that. You think there could be a different protagonist who could be a bit more kind of
spicy? Yeah, I know. I crafted him as an idiot. It was also version 1. an idiot, maybe just a naive observer. I think the role has something to do with it as well, to observe and not have power. You know, we were talking about, I think in your presentation yesterday, like if I just had agency and I was able to add my vote, my collective vote to increasing the room's temperature by 1%, maybe I would have power. And maybe the role of the observer also includes with it or has embedded the inability to have agency, other than to like, here are my notes, like it's an ineffective and I have no agency in this system, but I produce my recording. And so, I think to give him more awareness or more anticipation about the inevitability of the usurping of all of these kind of regulations, I couldn't figure out how to get less dystopic into that. Especially as an observer. I think if in edit 2 he has a different role, then I think he can begin to have some sort of power and maybe can raise the degree of the room the temperature of the room by a degree or two. We'll see. Yeah, I know, he's a bit of an idiot.
Thank you for wonderful presentation, incredible story. I had a curious question about how you see this story circulating. I think you mentioned the book or in the introduction, it was mentioned that you're putting together a book. Is that connected to this? How do you see this type of story circulating as a media object? What channels, what audiences? It's just fascinating stuff, and I'm curious about how you see it kind of
I've not gotten there yet. No, I've not thought about the circulation beyond, like right now it's a chapter. There are 4 written, 1/2, 2 or 3 in kind of various degrees of percentage completion. I think in the end it'll be about 12 different kinds of stories that sit in this. One of them I want to make into a short film, you know, continuing on the kind of work of the studio. And yeah, I'm thinking about which one has that kind of practice. It comes from a conversation we had with someone at Frame Store years ago in the studio when we had a conversation. We were looking about collaborations and we were presenting the work of the studio, and he was like, "Oh, yeah, this is an interesting idea. Why are they all films?" And we were like, "Well, what kind of question is that? We do short films." And he said, "Well, some of these concepts would lend themselves better to being an exhibition or a film, and so right now I'm still in the mode of kind of writing all of them, and then I want to really explore which one suits which kind of output and format. So I think this one, because he's such an idiot, it'd probably be an annoying film to watch. It's like, come on, you know what's going to happen. It's like watching Scream. So yeah, we'll see. Yeah, no, thank you for asking that. It's also part of the process, I think.
Well, actually, just as a follow-up, just because I was sort of thinking about that too, I don't know if you know Asha Crawford. She was at Denver, but I think she moved to somewhere else. But she actually had done this like a graphic novel that was sort of also focused around kind of theme of like ecological sort of ideas. But like I think what's interesting is that, or maybe this turns into some version of Sandmeier's Fables, a collection of short stories, right? But like, I think like there's almost like an audience, because like I feel like this is sort of there for as a sort of cautionary tale, right, to an audience that eventually will inherit the future, and so it'll be interesting to think about like that audience, so the audience that's kind of growing up or eventually live in this realm at some point.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think what I really want to do with this one is also write all of the, I guess, which fits into the speculative nonfiction genre, which is all of the clauses, the addenda, the treaty. I mean, not the full kind of 500-page version of a treaty, but an abbreviated treaty, to write all of this sort of documentation that sits alongside this world. So you have what might be the graphic novel version of it, but you have all of those kind of forms of documentation and policy that could also act as a different kind of cautionary tale. Like, please don't include Addendum 5.2 because it will be usurped. It will be used as a kind of tool to undermine. And yeah, again, think about all of those kinds of other facets of the world. It's kind of like any movie. 90%, like the iceberg, in a movie, 90% or 98% of the work is below the waterline, below the film. You see an hour and a half, or these days 2.5 hours of a film, and don't really know the work that sits beneath it.
Yeah, one more question. I'm just thinking directly with Gamblin's state of exception, and then because I'm thinking there's a kind of larger game here as well, because also it's very particular the kind of places that you're showing. It's somehow always a kind of flip from the West. So there's a particular eye that sees these kind of free trade zones and how these places have kind of kick-started economies in some cases, for example, in China, and in the other cases, kind of a consolidation of the economy that is slightly dying out. Then I'm thinking, is it so that there's that power is that which then shows us what these extreme places are somehow? You know, what signifies that? You know, I'm thinking directly with the dioramas that are present just in the next building. You know, a kind of exoticization of a particular place and a sealing of an ecosystem. You know, directly with Humboldt as well. So I'm just curious. A sealing, a kind of encapsulation. You know, with this very kind of put this as an object, and then you can objectify it and kill all the subjectivity that is present within it. You know, I'm just curious what you think about that, or if this even makes sense.
Is that how it came across?
No, I'm curious if it is so.
I mean, I wanted to do that with Neom, and we talked about Neom because he saw the image, I guess, when I sent, he's like, "No, wait, have you worked on Neom? What are you showing about Neom?" And I did want to objectify that project because I think it is already incredibly objectified, even though we don't know that much about it because of the 14 million NDA that sit around that kind of world. And when I finished the Neom section, I think a week or two later, it was announced that Neom would no longer extend the 170 kilometers that it's planned to, and just, I don't know, however many kilometers or meters it is currently. And so I did want to turn that into a kind of encapsulated image and close it, which is why he kind of goes in and leaves. Although I suppose in this version, he kind of goes in and leaves all three of the locations, and maybe that's why they felt more dropped in. It is not my intent to do that other than with Neom, which is also why I kind of, I think, use the lens process there. And if it comes across, I'd like to have that conversation later so that I don't do that in other stories. Yeah, I think, although as an architect, kind of writing these, in some way I do want to really kind of craft a sort of sense of a place, whether it's the fictionalized version of it. I think to just have some sort of quality that you describe.
I think maybe building up a bit on your question and like your discussion on your process, how you're prompting 40 times for that one word. Do you think that like the way that you write as an architect with these machines, with these kind of like models that we are now dealing with, do you think there's a kind of a strange new realm of almost like the geometric writing that like we are involved in as architects, because we are kind of like not like we are moving in language towards a result that we might want to see, like it's like by putting in or.
I'm going to try that. That's an interesting way to. So I've in all the cases so far, I've only done images for 2 of the stories. I've written them, and then afterwards. So I wrote this, and then I got the invitation. I was like, maybe I should try and turn this into a kind of image attached story. So in both cases, I've done the images afterwards. But that's an interesting challenge because for each story, I'm trying a different kind of way of thinking about space or a way of crafting a kind of written version of the exercise. To write it as with the intent to prompt is an interesting exercise.
Okay, are there more questions from the audience? I think
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much.